morning, everyone. On behalf of the ISO, I'd like to welcome you to today's Resource Adequacy Modeling and Program Design call to discuss straw proposal options for Track 2 availability and incentive mechanisms. My name is Christina Guimera, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs. Today's slide deck presentation is available on the initiative webpage. You can get to that page by going to kaiso.com, and then under the Stakeholder Center tab on the homepage, you'll see Policy Initiatives. If you click that link, it'll take you to our main initiative landing page, where you can then search for the initiative webpage. Next slide, please. This meeting is being recorded, and the video file will be posted to the initiative webpage for the information and convenience purposes only. The recordings and any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. And if you need any technical assistance at any point during the meeting, please send a chat to Inteller Events, the host. Next slide, please. To ask questions during the meeting today, you can open the participant and chat panels on the bottom right. You can then raise your hand by selecting the raise hand icon, or if you joined audio only, please press *3 on your device. For everyone joining us today, please state your name and affiliation first before speaking, and you can also send comments and questions via chat to all panelists. Next slide, please. This here is a visual representation of where we are in the stakeholder process. So here you can see that we're in the proposal development stage, right around the straw proposal point. Next slide, please. Today's agenda will include a discussion on availability and incentive mechanism reform for straw proposal options by Anya and Partha, and then we'll take a short break before Walter Graff from PJM discusses PJM's capacity performance pay for performance mechanism, and after that, we'll wrap up for the day. So with that, I'll turn things over to Anya and Partha. And next slide, please.
Kind of have another discussion focused on our availability and incentive mechanism reform. We kind of had a first bite of the apple at our February 11th meeting, and in today's meeting, we're going to do a deeper dive and also do some kind of some response to the feedback we received. One of those items was a desire to hear more about the approaches taken with pay for performance by some of the Eastern ISOs and RTOs, and so we have brought in Walter Graff around 11:15 to come and share some of their experience and lessons learned. If you're interested in seeing those slides, they have just been posted to our website. So please feel free to scan through that before he digs in. With that, let's go ahead and move to the next slide. In terms of some of the topics we'll be focused on this morning with our availability incentive mechanism reform is kind of going back to what's our problem statement? What challenge have we seen in the market, and what are we looking to reform? We'll also talk about our objectives with RAIN reform, take a look at a small subset of the data, and then talk about a current proposal option and attributes of that design for discussion, talk a little bit about the interactions with UCAP, and then, as mentioned, spend some time talking with Walter Graff about their capacity performance pay for performance mechanism. Next slide. So going back to our working group phase, the feedback that we received from stakeholders on the problem that exists with RAIN today really focused on challenges with kind of high bilateral prices as it compared to RAIN, and that there were many features of RAIN that reduced its effectiveness. The number of exemptions, the deadband, the monthly netting process, and just challenges that both the pricing and some of the attributes of RAIN caused that dampened the CAISO's ability to have a strong availability and incentive mechanism. And so there was a need identified by the working group to assess RAIN, to see if it was meeting its objectives, and reform it overall. I'm not going to read this slide, but this was the kind of agreed upon problem statement that the working group developed and was reflected in the discussion paper and our most recent issue paper. Next slide. I think it also helps to focus on, not just what the challenges are, but what are we looking to accomplish with any reform mechanism? And this is an area where I'd like to kind of continue to seek feedback if we're on the right track here, but really looking to have an incentive to meet the applicable must-offer obligations. We also want any replacement of RAIM to ensure that there is replacement capacity when resources go on forced outage. We understand that many PRMs have an assumption about forced outage, but when we look at the data, we are seeing forced outage rates exceed what is planned for. So really trying to create incentive mechanisms that provides an incentive to replace that capacity. Next slide. In the issue paper, we did provide a host of data. What I'll share this morning is really just some of the highlights, that our current RAIN penalty is far below what we see trading bilaterally, and we're also seeing increased forced outage rates, which could indicate that plants are choosing not to take planned outages and instead accepting the RAIN penalty because procuring replacement capacity is at a much higher cost than paying the RAIN penalty. And I think, if we move to the next slide, there's a lot of different ways for us to think about, the kind of current RA trading benchmarks. They're not all apples to apples, but if we look at the price of RAIN, which is at $4.40 per kW month, and compare that to kind of what is publicly benchmarked for what RA has traded for in the past, or has been quoted as a marginal price, or has been forecasted for the future, we do see that RAIN is far below those RA trading benchmarks. Next slide. The other challenge we see is forced outage rates that exceed our planned assumptions. We shared this slide in the working group phase, but this highlights for summer months for 2021 through 2023, the forced outage rates in the summer. And this includes both forced and planned outages, but the vast majority of outages listed here are forced, so that's around 97 to 98% of all outages. And that does show that, at least if you compare our outages to the assumption that we make for forced outages in the CAISO's summer study, that it often far exceeds that in these summer months. And so when we see forced outages above what's planned for, it's really taking away from the PRM and negatively impacting reliability. And again, we're looking to have a RAIN mechanism that incentivizes resources to meet their must-offer, but also provides replacement capacity for forced outages. Next slide. With that in mind, we are looking to reform our availability and incentive mechanism. As was briefly discussed in our February 11th meeting, we're moving towards a new mechanism, measuring unavailable RA, or MURA for short, which would really look to assess unavailability during stressed grid conditions. And then based on that level of unavailability, that resource would be penalized, and that penalty collected would then go to load. So this is a new mechanism, which means certain features of RAIN would no longer exist. When we think about what it means to be available, historically we've thought about the availability assessment hours. This new mechanism could transition to a different way to define availability, such as our EEA, RMO, and transmission emergency hours. Other features that may not exist anymore are allocating the penalty collected to overperformers, since the current suggestion is to allocate that penalty collected to go back to load. The rain deadband would go away, in part because we're looking at a much narrower set of hours. And then the exemptions would also go away. And this is really because we are looking to implicitly tie what being available is to the must offer. And so the kind of resource availability is really reflected in that must offer rather than through the exemptions. This isn't set in stone. This is really open for stakeholder feedback. This is a proposal on the table, but there's different attributes of the design that we'd like to get feedback on. And if we think about the framework for that feedback, it's really around, are we getting availability right? What should our assessment period be? What should the price of the penalty be? And when we think about that underperformance penalty collected, is it sending the right incentive to send it back to load, or are there other approaches we may want to take? And so if we go to the next slide, it takes another kind of deeper cut at some of those options on the table. And first, with availability, looking to have that tied to the must offer obligation to really have a direct link with our resources meeting their must offer requirements. And there's a recognition that this working group is going to revisit the must offer obligations and outage cards, particularly for hybrid resources. The other element of design we'll be discussing is the assessment period. As you're aware, the current RAIM looks at the availability assessment hours, so about 20% of all hours. And we're looking to target this towards more stressed grid conditions to really focus on when the grid needs these RA resources to be available, and looking to kind of more narrowly define it around our current transmission, restricted maintenance operation, and EEA hours. And looking for feedback on that proposal, since there are trade-offs with kind of the number of events and the extent that we're meeting the policy objective. The other kind of bookend approach would really be to tie this to reserve shortage events, which would be kind of the most narrow definition of when we're assessing RA must offer performance. Another kind of third aspect of design we're looking at is, how to price the penalty. One of the known challenges we've talked about and have documented is the price of RAIN being far below what is being traded for in the bilateral market. And so really having a fresh look at what makes the most sense to tie the price of the penalty to. Could it be a scaled version of the value of lost load? Should we tie it to RA benchmarking and kind of continue more of an administrative approach, but refresh that based on what we're seeing trading in the market? And another approach could be scaling the real-time 5-minute price to these events based on the level of scarcity conditions or kind of grid conditions in place. And so, starting with the perspective of having the penalty tied to RA benchmarking, but open to further discussion on either if there should be a different approach or how that should be done. And then the last pillar is really around cost allocation. And when we think about the penalty collected, how do we think about where that penalty collected goes? As a starting point, we're suggesting that this penalty is allocated to load in line with cost causation, really recognizing that LSEs are procuring RA for a certain level of reliability, and when that is not met, it results in a lower level of reliability, and looking to mitigate the impact of that lower level of reliability by sending it back to load. Next slide.
Anya, we do have a hand raised if you wanted to take a moment.
Sure, let's go ahead.
We have a hand raised by Carrie Bentley.
Hi, this is Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. This might not be the right place, so just let me know if it is. I wanted to talk about the statements you made about the goal of RAIM and the problem you were trying to solve. I had a couple questions and comments, but let me know if now is the right time or later.
Let's go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
This is a good spot. Sorry, I couldn't quite hear.
Yep, this is a good spot. I was just going to take us back to that slide.
Perfect. So, I hit on this a lot, which is trying to define the exact problem you're trying to solve. And when you were going over it at a high level, you said that the CAISO is receiving a forced outage rate above what is being expected, and that resources were not providing replacement for forced outages. So to me, I'm taking that as the problem. But I have a hard time with that a little bit in the data you're showing, because I think initiatives need to be forward-looking, not backward-looking. So really, I think, and I've commented on this before, what we should be looking at is the forced outages, and very specific forced outages, not the planned to forced, but the pure forced, and then comparing that to what's in the CPUC's loss of load expectation studies that are deriving the future PRM. Because it's not about looking at, the past where we had that static 15%. We are moving toward stochastic loss of load expectation modeling. And so in my mind, it would be incredibly important to know what is the actual forced outage rates the CAISO is seeing versus what's being planned for in the future by the PRM on that modeling, because that's what load is already paying for, and that's what already is in the PRM. So you don't want to double count that. And I get you want to have a mechanism to ensure that, you are not getting forced outages above that, or if you are, there's a mechanism perhaps to replace that capacity. But I don't think you want to replace all capacity for all forced outages, because even if that number is too low, some forced outage rate is in the PRM. So your mechanism shouldn't be to incent, to have it at the RA price and or higher, right, a very high penalty to incent all forced outage replacement, because that would be a double payment, because some of that is in the PRM. So I think when we start talking about the goal, it's really important to be a little bit more nuanced in exactly what you're trying to solve, by what percentage, at what times. And you got to that a little bit talking about, stressed periods, but then we should look at the data during those stressed periods. Is there actually a gap during those stressed periods? The limited data that we have reviewed during the 2020 outages and the 2022 close to blackouts actually showed very high performance, not low performance. So I think it's just really important to say, what do we actually need from a grid perspective, and present that data, because until you guys do that, I have a really hard time commenting on what the design should be, because to me, that's what the design should do. It should fix what you actually need. And right now, I think it's just a little too generalized. But maybe I'm missing something, and I would look forward to your reaction to that point and question.
Thanks, Carrie, for the feedback. This is part that, and maybe I'd like to, maybe we can exchange data. I think one of the things that we highlighted, and I think it's on the graph that you see on the screen, like when we look particularly at those September events for 2022, what we saw was we have very few of these, very, tight days with emergency conditions for an extended period of time. But we saw during those days, in particular in September of 2022, was forced outage rates that were significantly higher than what was being planned for, and was significantly higher than other days, other summer days. And there's a number of different explanations that could be come up with. Some of them were appeared to be associated with ambient rates. We looked at the data. Some were, what I described as sort of true forced outages on the system. We saw a pretty high correlation. So if you see different data, I'd love to sort of if you could share that with the group, I think that'd be really helpful.
Well,
I
I
think
think, Bertha, that's my point on being incredibly specific and nuanced about what you're trying to solve. So to me, you wouldn't want to solve ambient D rates through RAIM because you already have a proposal to solve ambient D rates. So when I'm looking at the 2022 events, I'm taking out those specific forced outages. Because what are the forced outages you're trying to solve for here, right? What's the additional capacity you want? And it's, in my mind, it's only what you're not solving through other policy proposals. So your plan to forced, right? You have other policy proposals to address that. Your ambient D rate, you have other policy proposals to address that. Even some of what you were saying about cost causation, UCAP is on the table. So you have other policy proposals to address that. So I think we need to narrow down what RAIM is trying to solve in the data itself. And so if you, for example, look at that 2022 data and you take out the plan to forest, you take out the ambient D rates, and maybe even focus on 2023 and 2024, and you say what's remaining after we take out those forced outages that we are solving through other mechanisms. To me, that is the pool of the problem that RAIM is supposed to solve.
Okay, and at least what I'll say on the ambient D rate, that was one portion of a number of attributes, but I don't think alone would sort of address it. My own take, at least at kind of a high level, is that obviously what we're trying to do here is to give RA some teeth within the ISO program. When resources are shown as RA to the CAISO, we feel like looking at best practices from other markets, as well as just the economics incentives, having consequences for non-performance that are tied to the impact that's being created in the system creates those correct economic incentives for availability. And so at that kind of foundational level, we think of this as sort of a good design element to have. Now, what those mechanisms look like, I think you're asking a good question of like, how much can be solved by UCAP? How much can be solved directly through, ambient requirements, which are being placed elsewhere? I think that's a fair question. I think we're trying to balance those. I think the need to have an additional incentive mechanism, MURA or some other type of design, was really kind of getting at the need to really focus in on having tighter and having stronger incentives during these critical periods, because that's when we really need the capacity, and because we'd seen sort of higher outage rates during those periods from certain resources being not available. So I think those are really kind of the problem statements. To your plan to force carry, I'd like to hear more. I do think of this as somewhat of an open issue as well. Like obviously we're trying to address holistically the outage and substitution processes to make them be more efficient and reliable. But to the degree that there's sort of an open incentive where if somebody who's, can't take a planned outage can basically say, well, I'm going to wait and have this either be a forced or an urgent, if there's not really a consequence to that in terms of what the, market incentive looks like, it still seems like a gap. And so I don't know that we've really addressed that planned to forced issue in terms of our proposal. So I think but if you had a different take on sort of where and how we're solving it, I'd love to hear, Carrie.
Yeah, or maybe Noah or someone else can weigh in. I mean, we went through those workshops a few weeks ago, and I thought a lot of the ideas presented were getting at that, the need for better planned outage management generally, and that a big goal of the proposals was to get rid of the planned to forced rules. So if we had a planned outage pool or a couple of the other ideas, we would change the rules and no longer allow this planned to forced mechanism we have today. And maybe that was just an assumption I made on my part, but that was kind of my take on a big reason we were changing the planned outage rules was to get rid of this issue. And then on your point before that, Partha, where you talk about needing forced outage replacement during tight periods and having teeth to the RA program. that the way UCAP is being set up is to penalize resources during those exact periods by making them ineligible to sell RA in the future. So I can't imagine doing both of these concurrently. That does seem like a double penalty to me. It seems like you'd want to have teeth. I certainly agree with that, but have the teeth in UCAP or have the teeth in RAIM. You probably wouldn't want both. That would just end up increasing RA prices needlessly, because ultimately all of this is priced in, right? If you expose resources to higher RAIM risk and higher penalties, they just pass that through into the contract costs. So you don't want to double penalize or force load to double procure, because then you're just needlessly adding costs.
I think, agree with that last comment. I think David wants to take on the plan to force. Maybe I'll add some context after you go, David.
Right. So the plan to force outage issue is, I don't know how much that should be part of this conversation, because this is about, incentives to perform and so on. And the plan to force outage issue is a concern about reporting of false outage information. And that's not a question of financial incentives or is RAIM too high or too low. That's a question of whether something is accurately and honestly reported as a forced outage. And, we went through this in PRR 1122 from, I guess, 5 years ago now, but our position as the ISO, I think, is pretty clearly laid out in that process. So, here, I think all we're looking at is the question of, if you want to take a planned outage and you don't have substitution, will we nevertheless say, yes, go ahead and take your planned outage? And that's, the question of the outage substitution pool and so on. But that's really a case where you're saying it's a maintenance outage, I want to take it, I don't have substitution or don't want to provide it, nevertheless you can take it. That's the issue I think we're trying to get at in this policy process. The idea of someone having a planned outage denied for whatever reason it's denied and then saying, I don't care, I'm doing it anyway, that's the plan to force outage issue, and that there's no place to say that's okay in this policy process.
Yeah, the tie-in as well, and Liz, to Carrie's point, super great context. I think part of the issue is that, obviously we're trying to make the pool improve efficiency, be more reliable. There still might be a gap. And so I think that, and that degree that a resource is on planned outage, it turns into an urgent outage or it turns into a forced outage. The idea that our plan to forced outage proposal in the end is going to solve all the issue with that and create where you don't need to have good incentives to do timely maintenance, to make yourself available ahead of time, to do good planning for these maintenance outages. And that we view that part of this incentive mechanism should really be creating that teeth to have consequences. So Carrie, to your point, I don't view it as necessarily solving all the issue associated with making planned outages easy to conduct as much as making it more efficient in terms of the use of substitute capacity within the ISO's design. But there's now 4 other colors too, but thanks for the impact, Carrie. I really appreciate your feedback here. And if you have any feedback on, particularly on the goals, and you want to sort of help sharpen our definitions, love to hear that feedback in your either here or in the written comments. But yeah, thank you.
Next in the queue, we have Perry.
Hey, this is Perry Cervidio, California Energy Storage Alliance. I had a couple other questions, but this conversation about the plan to force kind of triggered something in me. And I just wanted to say I disagree with what you all are saying about planned outages becoming forced outages being an issue. And that's because these planned outages it's CAISO that converts them to forced or force them to be converted to forced. These are outages that generator owners are trying to plan that maintenance ahead of time. and do it in an organized fashion. So it's a fiction that it would stem from some kind of thing that's just happening right now, like an equipment failure or the types of issues that you'd be trying to resolve typically under a forced outage construct. And it really stems from the substitution policy itself, which makes it even more confusing to me why we would think that a plan to force is a real forced outage. And we've had similar comments about this at the CPUC, and we'll be submitting comments on this later today. But it really stems from the fact that we don't have that clear definition of what is a real forced outage. And the current rules at the CAISO, with a bright line at less than 8 days, is completely divorced from decades of experience under NERC and the NERC-GAD system. So I would just ask you guys to just think about that perspective on whether a plan to force is a real forced outage that we would need to plan for or substitute for or get penalized for when the generator itself is actually trying to and has submitted that outage initially greater than 8 days prior to the outage within the planned time frame. And a lot of times it would be just held on CAISO's side and then flipped and then denied, forcing the outage to go into a forced state. But NERC-GADS would see that as a planned outage because it was submitted. It was submitted within a planned time frame, and it was an outage that took place in accordance with the time period that it was initially submitted for. Just ask you guys to maybe consider that perspective on the plan to forced issue. I also wanted to note, Carrie also talked about there being, we have to be careful about a potential double penalty here, and ask you guys, I would just ask you guys to consider that there's a real chance of that happening for the UCAP to the extent that the UCAP hours overlap any assessment hours that you would think of here. The way this is structured right now, at least to me, it appears to be just a strict penalty for not, for being on forced outage. And that will be captured within the UCAP itself and hit their ability to sell resource adequacy in the future going forward. Even more of an issue, I think, maybe than the UCAP ones would be any of your probabilistic based QC methods that you all would come up with if you're holding resources to, say, an ELCC. That ELCC is the result of a study that plans for a forced outage rate and a maintenance rate on those resources. So they're already getting hit with that type of penalty and how they can and how they're accredited. But I did have, those are just two thoughts because of everything that Carrie was just talking about. But I did have just a clarifying question, I think, if you can go to the proposal slide. Yeah, okay, so here, the question that I have, maybe it's better, the next slide is probably a better place because you're sort of teeing up the different varieties. When we talk about the availability side of this design, are we talking about basically a comparison of the available bids versus the RA quantity for the month? Is that what this is trying to measure?
It would be bids versus must offer obligation. And
okay, and it would be bids due to any type of outage or just bids due to forced outages?
Yeah, I think that those definitions are something we need to have more discussion on. I mean, I think the forced outage one is probably the easiest one, but I recognize that for if you're wanting to focus on storage in particular, we recognize that there are probably more conversations that would need to happen around that. One clarification too, before we get in on, on the possible proposal here, like the feedback we got from the last two meetings was sort of wanting something a little bit to chew on. And so what we really have here is a kind of possible proposal where we're having kind of starting points for the discussion. And so we want to have something where it's like, hey, here's something that people could react to and that we could at least start conversations on what the pros and cons are of different alternatives based on. So just for like general stakeholder awareness, I think that's how we're thinking about this discussion, was really sort of trying to address that request by stakeholders to, give something to react to in today's discussion. So thanks.
Okay, but the thought, thanks for that part. But the thought here though is we're still just talking about a comparison of bids due to some, either you're looking at the available bids, which is what RAIM does today, or you're looking at maybe a forced outage rate or during the assessment hours type of assessment. Is that right? Or is this also for planned outages?
No, this is not for planned outages. This is really kind of a comparison of bids versus must offer.
Well, if it's the bids, it'll be inclusive of, or you'll have less bids due to planned outages also. So if you are really trying to target the forced outages, then you probably need to look at the forced outage data itself rather than looking at the actual bids that are submitted. And then the other question I had was, is this going to look at day ahead availability, day ahead availability of bids only, or will it stem into real time as well?
I think we'd like to have it as day ahead and real time, and thanks for that question.
Yeah, the real time one is where I struggle. I know it's part of the RAIM design today, but real time for me it gets a little bit trickier. I guess if you're just looking at the availability of the bids themselves, maybe it's not as tricky. I think it gets trickier if you would start going down a road of a pay for performance type design. But as long as you're in a bid assessment and this is a true availability assessment, I'll think more about if it's if there are issues in real time. But yeah, thanks for those clarifications.
Sorry, Perry, I didn't fully follow your kind of concern with real time. Was there a
There's not a concern if this design, I don't think there's a concern if this design is staying within an assessment of the availability of bids.
Okay, you're just honing in on, yes, this is just for availability versus if this were to extend to also performance. Thank you.
Yep, yeah, thanks.
All right.
Next in the queue, we have Alva.
Alva, you may be double muted still.
Alva, you're unmuted in WebEx. Check to see if your microphone is muted.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Very faintly. You may need to just speak up.
It just comes in. Yeah, I just wanted to ask about the.
Hey, Alva, sorry to interrupt. You're coming in very faintly.
Okay.
Are you on a headset?
No, I'm not. I took off the headset. I was trying to. I've got.
Okay, we can hear you now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. I'll keep this brief because it just goes in and out. But I wanted to get some sense of the plausibility of Carrie's story in terms of. So I've heard Partha say that there's still a gap, considering the sort of the portfolio of changes that you're considering here, and I think that I'd like to hear sharpened more. But the other question was, is this portfolio being considered as a single portfolio of changes that would all come in at approximately the same time, or is there also a time gap here in terms of what gets implemented when, in terms of resolving the issues? Because I thought your slides, Anya, really presented clearly that there is an issue and it needs to be dealt with.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question, Alva. I think we're still looking from an implementation timeline perspective. I think we're thinking about these as a comprehensive package that all should work together to meet the desired goals. From an implementation standpoint, I think we're still working through what that would look like. And certainly if there is a timing gap, we want to consider what the implications are of that. To your first point about sort of the additional, like, to me, like there's been a lot of comments on like this is a double penalty, and to me what this really is kind of like a, the goal will be to have sort of all the gears working together in a comprehensive manner to produce sort of the correct incentives. And I think like what Carrie described and others described is right. There are ways, if we described it as sort of one big mechanism, we could just say, like, how much do we want the incentive to be done through a UCAP design? How much do we want it to be, should we focus on UCAP design more on very stressed hours in terms of what we're looking at because we want to give a heightened incentive to being available during those hours? And then as well, I think there are sort of questions around whether or not like just a delayed incentive in terms of the counting methodology that's applied to future years is right, or if there should be sort of some consequence in the current year to be non-available. And so I think that based on the stakeholder feedback, we kind of thought this was kind of a, it's a little bit of belts and suspenders, but it's also providing maybe a slightly different function in terms of what that design looks like. So ideally, you'd have it be all working correctly to provide good overall incentives, but I think that was sort of the overall goal of having sort of both of these functions potentially. We also recognize as well that a lot of the UCAP stuff is in flux, and there's a lot of questions just in terms about will it be applied on a standardized basis by the ISO versus is this something that's sort of more of a individual LSE, some might choose to have it, some might not. So I think there's sort of a lot of outstanding questions about what that UCAP design and process ultimately looks like here.
Yeah, I think there is a need for kind of a view of a coherent overall design for those of us who are just stakeholders. I heard a lot of, very pointed argumentation from Carrie and Perry, but just trying to understand the overall design and whether it all hangs together, I'm not completely clear about it. So thank you very much, Partha.
Thanks, Alva.
Next up, we have a question from Chris.
Hey, this is Chris Devon with TerraGen. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks. So I thought there were some really good points and questions by Carrie and Perry, respectively. I think I was really planning to say some of the same things that Perry had mentioned. That like on the plan to force part of it, I think it's really just a planned outage again, and it does kind of become a forced outage due to all of the policies and implementation of the RA program that has resulted in some of those outcomes, which I think we're trying to fix, right? So I appreciate Alva's points too here. Just a couple other thoughts, in general, it does seem like we're like, I appreciate your reaction, Partha, about, maybe this is a bit of belt and suspenders, but I think it feels to me like when you're, describing all these different pieces, it feels more like a Rube Goldberg machine when we're talking about all this stuff with all these different mechanisms in play. And it seemed like CAISO had been going forward with the UCAP design. The CPUC has indicated they're going forward with the UCAP design. And, to Perry's points, these other resource types that have counting that's based on historical, exceedance levels or ELCC that are more probabilistic, look at these outages already and take them into account in the capacity accreditation. And, similarly in the UCAP concept, that accounts for most of this as well. So I still keep coming back to this. Does seem that it will be a double penalty. If you want to avoid that, you could potentially have both of these paradigms, the UCAP paradigm and this MURA paradigm in place. You probably have to exempt some of the resources, like how VERS are exempted from rain. And then, other use limited types are exempted from rain. And then you could, create a complex settlement process that unwinds the UCAP, assessment during the periods when the MURA is assessed or something. So there is ways that you could actually, have both of these in place. But I would just encourage you to think about how to simplify things here. I mean, it seems like this is making stuff more complex than we have today. And I think one of the ideas of RA reform going way back, to prior 2020 timeframe is that we, want to try to simplify all this stuff. And so I tend to disagree with the concept of adding more belt and suspenders and trying to get it right in the modeling and try to get it right within the PRM. The PRM and UCAP should be able to solve 99% of these issues if we just get it right. And I think, this is going down a path where we're overly complicating it, but we're actually not really looking at the full big picture of all of these impacts on especially on the supply side. I mean, I think we have every intention of being available to the market when needed. And I don't know if we need extra layers of incentive or extra layers of penalty if we're already accounting for that in both the planning, procurement, and the accreditation piece. So just some initial reactions here I wanted to add to the discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. And maybe just to follow up on that, if you wouldn't mind raising your hand again, just trying to think of what Terragen's proposal is. If there's an overall concern with RAIM or any sort of RAIM reform or MURA, is Terragen's proposal that there's just UCAP applied and no availability and performance incentive? Is that the recommendation I'm hearing?
I mean, we don't have a formulated proposal because this stuff is very complicated. I think, that's really up to CAISO and the CPUC to decide how this program should be enhanced and developed. But I mean, personally, having worked on RA stuff for well over a decade, I would say that it would be preferable to have just a UCAP design and, accreditation and then, make sure we get the counting right. I mean, that seems to be a more straightforward approach to me. Now, obviously that's simplifying the overall complexity that we have in California with the monthly program and all the credits and different resource types and complexity we have on the grid, right? But to try to simplify it seems like a pretty worthy goal, as opposed to maybe adding more layers here or more gears, so.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Next in the queue, we have Mike.
Everyone, this is Mike Whitney with NCPA. Just a couple of quick reactions and comments to the slides that have been presented so far. First off, with the graph showing the summer outages, the fact that most of them are forced is to be expected because good utility practice kind of dictates planning outages in the summer and the fall. And so that's what, we aim to do is get all that planned maintenance done in the off-peak period. And then, things come up during, high heat conditions, vibrations, leaks and whatnot. There's a short notice opportunity RA outage that can be utilized to address those. But one of our proposals is a medium notice opportunity RA outage where if conditions are favorable, like the 2-week outlook is showing favorable conditions, low load conditions, low temperature conditions that we've experienced in some summer months, then to submit a planned outage and, similar to a forced short notice outage. And then if conditions change, then CAISO can, reject that outage and then the SC can reschedule it. So, so the fact that there's a lot of forced outages in summer isn't surprising. So, so I think, yeah, that would be one way to address that is to give SCs and generators other opportunities to submit as planned, and then if conditions change, then it can get rejected. So just a quick comment there, and then looking at summer 22, that was pretty much the worst heat event I think in like 50 or 60 years. 23, 24 haven't been replicated. So, so it's kind of an outlier. I don't know that too much focus should be put on that particular year. I know, you know, with climate change, we all expect the things to get hotter, but that was just totally extreme outside of any kind of planning parameters. As far as substituting forced outage, there's a similar bus requirement on those that makes it almost impossible to substitute forced outages unless you have an identical resource on the same bus, which my understanding is pretty rare. You know, that pretty rare. Like there's just maybe a couple of examples of those in our fleet. So maybe loosen up those substitution requirements. More similar to the plan time frame. Potentially that might incentivize more substitution. I agree with the other commenters that the overlapping, you know, RAIM or MURA and UCAP, you know, double, triple punitive. Definitely, yeah, you know, it seems like we should be looking at maybe updating RAIM as opposed to creating a new RAIM. They seem pretty similar, except it's just, you know, the MURA is more of a penalty, whereas the RAIM is an incentive mechanism. You know, the cost allocation is different. The penalty would be more severe. Yeah, I guess the question for the CAISO RA team is why aren't we looking at adjusting the RAIN price ratio to the CPM? It's currently only at 60%. That must have been a negotiated value from 10 years ago or so. Why don't we look at increasing it? I guess that's just a question for the team there, like to 80% or 100%.
Mike, thanks for your comments. Maybe just a request for Christina. Could you go to the slide that has the kind of summer forced outage rates and kind of the planning assumption? So, Mike, you hit on a number of issues and topics, and I'll try and take them one by one, but you kind of called out how some of the assumptions around forced versus planned for summer months, and I did want to call out that this graph is really looking at both forced and planned, but planned outages is only making up 2 to 3% of all the outages on this slide. And so, you know, one, you know, this is looking at both topics. I think you had flagged that this might just be forced. Second, you know, our key concern is that we're seeing forced outage rates far exceed what we're planning for, and that really does eat into the PRM and degrade reliability. And so we're looking to create incentives to have capacity available to reliably operate the grid. And then your point on, you know, the price of RAIN. You know, we haven't finished going through the slides, but one of the key topics for us to discuss is, you know, our approach moving forward for the price of this penalty or a kind of successor to RAIN. And so, you know, whether that's kind of changing the approach to be instead of kind of 40% of the CPM soft offer cap to making it 100, or whether that's based on other benchmark prices, we're open to feedback there in terms of what approach we take. Any other topics? Oh, and the last item that you kind of talked about was just this medium notice opportunity outage, and I think that's kind of ripe for discussion in the kind of track 2 area of, you know, how we're looking to reform our outage substitution processes. So maybe just a plug to stay tuned and involved in that track.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Next in the queue, we have Paul.
Hi, this is Paul Nelson with the CPUC Energy Division. Just a first quick sound check. You can hear me okay?
Coming through clearly, Paul. Thanks.
Thank you. I just want to first respond to Chris Devon, and then I'll have 2 questions. You know, Chris said, let's keep it simple. And I kind of wholeheartedly agree with that as a goal, but I'm going to kind of change it is more of a question. Can we keep it simple? And he did sort of allude to this issue in his comments, is that planning the systems has become more complex than it was, 20 years ago, and when a lot of the tools and stuff that were developed. I mean, we have a lot more resources that are not available 24/7. They have shapes. We've got storage, to try to do these things, and storage and the fold back as issue. So unfortunately, the power system has become more complex. I think that's why we've seen more complex resource adequacy requirements, such as the CPUC slice a day. So I definitely agree with, we should look to, can we keep it simpler? But unfortunately, I think, we'd all like to have it much simpler. I'm not sure if it's possible given the nature of, the emergent resource mix. So now on to my question. I got two questions. One is, this is on page 14 or slide 14 on the price of penalty. You have scaled real-time dispatch price, and I'm not sure what scaled means. That's my first question. And the second question is, have you thought about using the day-ahead price? And you mentioned earlier this mechanism is trying to look at both day-ahead and real-time, and since most of the financial settlement that occurs in the CAISO is day ahead. That's the bulk of the revenues. The financial is day ahead. Have you thought about using a day ahead price? So.
Well, thanks for your kind of observation and question there. And I just wanted to also kind of support that feedback that, the RA program is complicated, and in part that is due to a more complex grid and resource mix and load mix. So agree with you there. When we have the options available for pricing RAIM, we haven't gotten into those quite yet, but what you'll see later on slide 24 is some of the pros and cons with the various approaches. And while your question was around what does scaled mean, I think there's a recognition that if we went down the path of having a MURA penalty tied to transmission, RMO, and EEA, that those are varying levels of tight grid conditions. And maybe if you were to base this on a real-time price, you would have to do a kind of scaled version or factor that penalty. So maybe for a EEA3, it's 10 times the real-time price. Whereas for a transmission emergency, maybe it's 2 times the real-time price. So that gets at your first question on what did we mean by scaled, whether that's scaled or factored, kind of a multiplier of that price. We haven't necessarily kind of had the discussion around day ahead or real-time. I think it might be helpful to go to either our market planning and performance slides or some of the materials developed by DMM in terms of what we see in terms of the price levels for those 3 different market runs. You're right in that the kind of a majority of the transactions happen in day ahead, but there are price differentials between day ahead 15-minute and real time. I also just wanted to note for kind of the concept or approach to use a real-time price, one of the reasons we're recommending RA benchmarking is that for a scaled real-time price, while it can represent the economic consequences that unavailable RA contributed to, there are also a lot of reasons why we're leaning towards not using a real-time price. First, kind of recognizing it's an apples to orange comparison of RA versus energy. Also recognizing that while unavailable RA may have contributed to that real-time price, it may not be the sole driver. And then kind of similarly, there's also an argument that there are scenarios where maybe with a localized transmission emergency, real-time or even day-ahead prices may not really create an incentive to be available, in that prices may still be very low. And so even if you were to multiply them, it could be still below today's RAIN, and recognizing that's a scenario. So our leaning today is not towards using scaled real-time prices, but for the sake of discussion and having options on the table and discussing what those various pros and cons are, we did list it as an option for discussion purposes. So curious if you've got any feedback to some of my response there, but we do have additional slides that get into this later on.
Yeah, I think I'll wait and look forward to the what's going on the RA benchmarking. That's problematic because it the lag that occurs in the benchmarking. The CPUC's power charge indifference amount benchmarking is continues to seem to be problematic. So so that's a caution on trying to benchmark.
Thanks, Paul. And I wanted to get more into the future slides on the RA benchmarking options. I will say, like, one thing that could be a proxy for is that, kind of an administrative set value. I think we recognize some of the challenges with vol, as well as some of the challenges that Anya alluded to with sort of scaling day ahead or real-time prices. And so it could be sort of, RA benchmarking could also be less sort of looking at sort of the practices and basis of other markets in terms of setting incentive values via their pay for performance and capacity performance mechanisms, and sort of seeing what the best practices look like, because there's a variety of ways that they've sort of thought about those designs sort of beyond what I would describe sort of the pure economics, but just describing sort of what the implications are to capacity prices, the risk to resources making themselves available as RA, sort of the integrity of the program design in terms of sort of creating too much financial risk, things like that. So I think we can get into the specifics, but yeah, Paul, love to hear more of your feedback on sort of like which path, like if there's anything that we should be pursuing more heavily. I'd love to hear your feedback on, the pros, at least cons, and
I mean, for right now, it's I'm in exploration mode, kind of hearing what would be the two approach. I don't really have a position at this point. So I'm kind of, I guess, wait. I need to see more of the presentation, what's coming. So.
That's awesome. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you.
The last hand in the queue is Noah.
Hey, this is Noah Tom from Middleware Power. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Great. Morning. So, I think a lot of the discussion is going on about what are the problems we're trying to solve and so forth. So I'd like to, if possible, can we go back to slide 12, which is, you're talking about the summer 2021, 2023 plan and forced outage rates. The statement talks about 7.5% assumptions made in the forced outages by the ISO within its summer loads and resources assessment. And the graphic for the plan and forced outage rates sort of showing that additional, we have something like 7% more sometimes, higher than 7.5. Generally speaking, when you're making the ISO is making the resource assessments, it's generally updating the assumptions on an annual basis, right? Or is it based on history? Or is the ISO sort of just sticking with the 7.5 because that's what it should be?
Can I ask Noah for clarification? Are you talking about like within the context of our planning studies? Or
yeah, if you're going, can we go back to slide 12? Right. So in here you have a 7.5% assumption that's being made in the summer assessments and so forth, and you're highlighting the fact that outages or planned and enforced outage rates are higher than 7.5, which is the reason. What I interpret as the reason you want to make changes. Right. So my question then is, generally the first question is, are we updating assumptions? to ensure that you have the right set of assumptions for your own assessments?
Yeah. That's a fair question, and I probably won't, without our planning folks here, I probably won't go into the details of our assessment process. I think it's a fair question for, obviously, like the PUC and other LRAs play a major role in actually setting the requirements within the PRMs. I think it's a fair question about how the actual observed outage rates filters back into those assumptions. I think maybe the key point would be, I think that the incentives matter. And I think that the incentives matter in terms of, like, obviously there's a variety of ways in which we're providing incentives between, like, the day ahead and real-time prices, but another component of it is if you're shown as RA, what are the consequences for not being available, and that it might not be the only driver of it being sort of higher than what we're planning for, but I think kind of regardless, I think that is sort of seen as needing to have some teeth to provide good incentives, particularly during those periods, to be available. Is probably the key message. But I think it's a fair takeaway. Maybe we can take it back, and I can bring back in some of our planning folks for.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I will say, I think, on principles, I agree with you wholeheartedly that the resources should be made available to the ISO for the market. And I think that's all, as what Chris was saying, we're all targeting that. At the same time, if the assumptions are stale, and we continue to sort of hammer in that historic outages are higher than the assumptions, then the first thing to do sort of is to ensure that your summer assessments are correct is update the assumption, which is what we would expect of any type of LOE analysis, right? We've seen this with the track one that Aditya is doing, and noting that the ISO's outage assumptions were based on like 2004 through 2012 and were not updated for its first run. So having said that, would you be able to provide this graphic that parse it out by natures of work in the sense of transmission-induced outages, ambient rates, short notice opportunity outages, and so forth? That would really help with understanding the incentive structures that are currently in place within the ISO for the ISO tariff, to better understand what are the causes of forced outage rates. I think without this or just without that information, when simply looking at this graphic, there may be an implicit bias that resources just aren't available at all. But we do not know whether or not it's their fault, or maybe the transmission system, the wildfires taking out the transmission system, make them not available, and they can't do anything about it.
No, we can take that back and see if we can parse this out by nature of work.
Yeah, thanks. That would be really helpful. And then, have you thought about whether or not MORA would be applicable to all resource types and accreditations? I thought potentially there was a discussion at the last meeting, on February 10th or 11th, I forget which, probably 11th, that in your mind, maybe MORA would only be applicable to QC methodologies to which LRAs do not take a haircut, for performance.
That's a great segue to kind of some of our future slides on what do we mean by availability. And at this time, we are looking at kind of having this applied to all resources. So maybe with that, we can kind of go back to slide 14. But Noah, I think we're about to kind of get into that applicability and availability question. and maybe we can see if you've got additional feedback after I review those slides.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, so this next part of the presentation, we are going to do a deep dive on most of the columns you see here related to availability, the approaches that we could take for the assessment period, and the approaches we could take for the price of the penalty. So let's go ahead and move to slide 15. So as mentioned, we are looking to have the availability mechanism tied to must-offer obligations, recognizing there's a need to develop that for hybrid resources, and a recognition to just broadly revisit the must-offer obligations. And in some ways, this would impact, which resources have MURA applied to it. You can think of a solar or wind resource where, in real time, their bid that is kind of accepted by the CAISO kind of moves up to that forecast. And so they're effectively always meeting their must-offer requirement if they are not on a planned or forced outage. I also wanted to note that we do recognize that the CEC and CPUC are working on a DR qualifying capacity proposal, and we plan to kind of accommodate that moving forward. I'm going to move through these next slides for the sake of time, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. I don't see any hands right now. But the other area of feedback that we're interested in is really some of the assessment period options, and there's trade-offs with those. And so you heard us outline in our kind of placemat slide that we're leaning towards narrowing the hours from AAH to just be transmission, restricted maintenance, operation, and EEA hours, and recognize there would be kind of another bookend approach of just doing it during reserve shortages. And I think, if we look at the pros and cons of all of these approaches, today with the availability assessment hours, it's really a year ahead forecasted period of RA need. And one of the challenges that we have with RAIM kind of being tied to the AAH, kind of coupled with the monthly netting and the deadband, is it's not always aligned with real-time stressed grid conditions. And there was feedback during the working group period to kind of align our RAIM successor with more of stressed grid conditions. And along those veins, we thought it would be prudent to tie it with kind of what we notify market participants of and the public of when it comes to when we are experiencing tight grid conditions defined by the emergency event hours, restricted maintenance operation hours, and transmission event hours. And so this is very much aligned with our stress grid conditions. But when we think about all of those various options, we do recognize that there are some challenges in thinking about the implementation of this for kind of local versus system transmission emergencies and sending the appropriate incentive to bid during those periods. And then lastly, the other approach we could take is to simply apply this during reserve shortage conditions. This is very much the approach that PJM and ISO New England take when they kind of apply their pay for performance during contingency reserve shortfalls. And, one of the benefits is this looks at availability when the grid is kind of in a extreme reliability event. But a big con to this is it may not occur frequently enough to provide a meaningful incentive and is really just occurring during that emergency event instead of kind of providing that incentive to be available leading up to load shedding. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide. Since our kind of option that we're putting out for consideration is to tie this to restricted maintenance operation, transmission emergency, EEA watch through EEA3, we thought it'd be illustrative to identify, how often have these various events occurred from the 2022 through kind of early, kind of just for January of this year. And just recognizing there are limited event hours that have occurred. You can see that in the last, just a little bit over 3 years, we've had one EEA3 versus kind of 42 instances of restricted maintenance operation hours. I don't want this to be taken in isolation. If we don't get the price of the penalty right, that could drive up the number of these events. But I think it's helpful to understand, based on kind of prior grid conditions and historical events, how frequently these events have occurred, to give some indication of how often MURA could be potentially called or triggered in the future. Our next set of slides gets into some of the options. Thank you. These next set of slides get into some of the different ways that we as a working group could think about some of the penalty price options for this new MURA mechanism. One of those approaches is the value of loss of load events, which really represents the economic consequence of such an event. The second approach is RA benchmarking, and this could be kind of a catch-all to use RA bilateral prices or hub prices to really set an administrative penalty price to approximate really the cost of RA replacement based on what we're seeing RA trading for. And then a third approach that we touched on briefly with Paul Nelson's question is really potentially tying this to real time. We could think about day ahead prices in terms of this could represent the real time impact that unavailable RA contributed to. And this could be scaled based on the level of scarcity, meaning if we were in an EEA3 event, it could be a much higher penalty, for example, maybe 10 times the real-time price, versus if we're in a restricted maintenance operation hour, maybe it's 1 times the RTD price. So thought it'd be helpful from just an exploration perspective to talk about what these options could mean. And let's go ahead and move to the next slide. And maybe the first place to start is, what's the penalty of RAIM set by today? It's currently 60% of the CPM soft offer cap price, so it's around $4.40 per kW month. The soft offer cap is really seen as a proxy for the system marginal capacity cost and is used in the CPM. And it's really a subset of the fixed cost for a new resource. And it was based on a mid-cost 550 megawatt combined cycle resource with duct firing capability. So this is kind of what RAIM is based on today as a bit of background. And let's move to the next slide to talk about other approaches we could take. The first of which is looking at the value of a loss of load event, which is a way to estimate what's the cost to consumers if there was an interruption in supply. So what is the cost to consumers, or how do they value having reliability? And one way that we could take that vol and apply it to RA is really anchoring it and scaling it to these vol estimates. To say, maybe an EEA3 is 90% of the value of loss of load event, whereas the RMO is 10% of that vol estimate. And these are just examples. And let's go to the next slide to talk about this a little bit further. Some of you that may have been in the price formation enhancement scarcity pricing discussions have had a more comprehensive discussion of vol and its applicability for scarcity pricing. It sounds like some of the outcomes of that conversation was that vol is very BAA specific, which may make it challenging to develop kind of for EDAM with many BAAs in place and many different cost estimates of what vol could be on a per BAA level, but could make it more applicable for the CAISO BAA and therefore for resource adequacy. The general principle is to design an operating reserve demand curve so that it represents the expected value of a loss of load. And so it's the risk-weighted cost of load shedding. So what is the consequence of load shedding versus the probability of that load shedding event occurred? And as reserves become more scarce, you should see the price of the reserves increase proportionally. And if we were to take that approach as it's kind of used more with kind of setting reserve price shortage pricing, it would mean to kind of have us conduct studies that estimate the economic cost of outages for different customer types within the CAISO BAA, and then set administrative penalty prices derived from that vol estimate. And as I mentioned, maybe that's, you know, an EEA3 is at 90% of vol, whereas a RMO could be at 10%. So that is one approach that we could take. And I'll get into some of the pros and cons with these approaches later on. The second approach we could take, and let's move to the next slide, slide 22, is to do this kind of, and this is our kind of current leaning or option that we're recommending for the straw proposal, and that's doing that based on benchmarking, and really that would be kind of trying to approximate the cost of RA replacement based on benchmark prices and creating more of an administrative penalty price based on, you know, what is RA trading for and collecting that from market participants, or basing that on what's published by other entities, whether that's FERC's EQR data, the CPUC's prices, or potentially even hub prices. And do we base it on one of these or kind of a mixture of them, but some way to really kind of identify what would the replacement cost of RA be based on. Christina, could we go ahead and take Paul Nelson's question?
Hi, this is Paul Nelson with the CPUC Energy Division. Of the hub prices, why 2 hubs outside of California? Why wouldn't you look at perhaps the intertie, California intertie?
No, that's a good question. Love to give people's feedback on the trade-offs. I think there was more of these were liquid hubs that had sort of often historically had sort of significant volumes of trade. So that was sort of seen as an option. I recognize that there are other factors that could be used, but I think that was, at least from my standpoint, one of the basis of having that as an option.
Yeah, I guess, have you looked at what the, you know, looking at the historical prices when California was having, you know, like in 2022, you know, some of these issues is what those prices were they good proxies for California costs or not?
So you're asking, are they good? Yeah, that's a fair. Sorry, go ahead, Paul.
Well, what I think you're saying is you're trying to use these as proxies for the value of energy in RA prices in California. And the reason you were doing it is because they're 2 liquid hubs, which I understand, you know, having liquidity is good. But the question is do they represent good proxies for actual RA capacity into California? I don't know.
No, thanks, Paul. Those are good points. I think that that's something that we probably would need to consider more going forward, or like that. Like, to me, almost all of these could be sort of starting points for the conversation around what the incentives could look like. Obviously, for any one of these, they are weighted in different manners to where if we're looking at providing, what's the right incentive on a super stressed day where the hub prices might be trading, the 16-hour block energy price might be trading at, $1,000 at Palo Verde or Mid-C, what the incentives look like, what the prices look like focusing on that single day might be very different. Like almost all the other data is aggregated in a manner that looks like at a monthly, looks at some sort of average price. It's certainly not at the daily granularity in terms of what those other RA prices look like. So kind of like how strong a mechanism you want this to look like and what you want to accomplish, I think is kind of the key question. That hub price, I think, could, it does reflect kind of on that day. It could be that the hub price is really that monthly average hub price, in which case maybe it's not providing that same level of value. If it was based upon like the daily traded price, it might be really reflecting, here's what, RA look like, or what a combination of energy and RA products sold at Palo or Mid-C was trading on that given day. So I think it kind of depends on kind of what that structure looks like. I don't know, Paul, if you have any other take of like which one of these options we should be sort of honing in more on, I think love to hear that feedback, because I think you're bringing up sort of good questions, Paul. But yeah, any feedback?
All right, thank you.
Appreciate it.
Next in the queue, we have a question from Rahul.
This is Rahul from AES. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you, Rahul.
So I have a couple of questions. From the bullet points here, the FERC EQR data, I'm wondering if CAISO staff has already reviewed and believe that the data is available in the format that could be used.
I think, we're first looking to kind of understand, is benchmarking the right approach? Is there a certain kind of path forward? We also recognize, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but one of kind of the larger challenges is data lags in terms of when this data is kind of collected by FERC versus when it's published. And similarly with some of kind of the CPUC RA report in terms of when that report is published versus kind of the time of collection. So maybe rather than kind of the format, we're really interested in directional feedback on kind of the approach to the penalty and really thinking about leveraging some of these benchmark prices to be indicative of what RA is trading for and looking for the group's feedback on kind of the appropriateness of using some of these benchmark prices. And I appreciate hearing some of that feedback from Paul, and I'm curious, Rahul, is your recommendation to kind of exclude it? Is there a concern with the format? Is there a concern with the timeliness of that FERC EQR data? Curious what some of your thoughts are around that question.
It's both, like, our experience has been, it's not a standardized format. So if you might see contracts, you might see different terms, different lengths. So our limited experience has been, it's good to get a view, but I don't know if it's good to do some analysis on, unless you standardize it. So that's my feedback on the EQR. And I'll ask one more question while I have the mic. I'm wondering, what's CAISO's view of using energy prices as a substitute for a penalty for RA? Right? Is the incentive that when the energy price is really high, that's when the capacity is really needed? And what I'm trying to grapple with is, what is the incentive for the penalty, right? Like, is the incentive for penalty is you better show up, or this is the penalty you have? And if you're using energy price as a substitute, the rationale that it captures the worst or the highest need of the system.
I will kind of take that as a great segue to our next slide to kind of wrap up the discussion on pricing, and feel free to stay on the line in case you have follow-up after I review these. But let's go to slide 23. And kind of as mentioned in that placemat slide, our leaning is towards kind of having something more administratively set and using, kind of leveraging some of the RA trading prices for benchmarking to create that administrative price. But for the sake of discussion and exploration with the working group, also are discussing for feedback, kind of taking a penalty approach of doing it based on a factor of real-time pricing, since that represents the actual cost of serving load in a 5-minute interval. If this were kind of the approach selected, it could be scaled. And some of the rationale here is, if load is procured for a desired level of service and unavailability defined by not meeting a must offer increases those prices, there's an open question of, should that price be returned kind of commensurate with the increased pricing that non-available RA contributed to. But, there are some kind of reasons why we are more cautionary around and kind of concerned with using real-time prices. It's really an apples and oranges comparison to use energy prices for capacity. It may not really reflect the unavailability consequence. Unavailable RA might not be the sole driver for high marginal prices. And conversely, we might see some scenarios where penalty prices just might be too low to incentivize reliability. And I think, that might come about more with some of the local transmission emergencies or RMO events. And so recognizing that there's kind of a deeper divide and disconnect with some of those stress conditions. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide and then come back to Rahul. I think with all of these options, we do see pros and cons with all of them. And again, we are leaning towards kind of this RA benchmarking and administrative price as the option for the straw proposal. But with the value of a loss of load event, one of the benefits is its ability to really represent the economic consequences of a loss of load event, or getting close to that loss of load event when you're looking at kind of stressed system conditions. But one of the cons is, if it's not appropriately scaled, it could be prohibitively high. And when we look at the value of loss of load estimates in other ISOs and RTOs, MISO's $35,000 per megawatt stands out as an example. And, if we were to base MURA on a loss of load, a value of loss of load that was kind of equally high, it's overly punitive and isn't necessarily sending the right signal. Another challenge with the value of loss of load is it is very challenging to both develop and kind of do those surveys to understand the value of loss of load, but it's also really challenging to scale it, as I just mentioned, in terms of kind of defining that appropriate price. For RA benchmarking, one of the benefits is if it's priced right, it could represent an equivalent value of missing capacity. But, if we were to solely base it on kind of RA prices, there are challenges and data lags with what RA is trading for. And so we are interested in kind of developing something that best approximates that. And sometimes just that collection of what RA is trading for may not represent missing capacity on stress days. So that's something to consider. And then lastly, with real-time prices and scaling it, it does represent an economic consequence that unavailable RA contributed to. However, we recognize unavailable RA may not be the sole driver. And again, it's that apples and oranges comparison of energy to capacity. And we may see periods where the penalty prices are too low to incentivize availability during stress conditions. So there's kind of pros and cons with all of these approaches, but when we look at them holistically, we are leaning towards the RA benchmarking or administrative approach, just in light of kind of balancing those pros and cons appropriately. So let me pause there and see, Rahul, any follow-up or thoughts in light of this discussion on pros and cons and some of the options?
We'll go to the, we do have a couple folks in the queue we can go to. We'll go to, we've got Perry next.
Hey, this is Perry Servideo, California Energy Storage Alliance. I do have a comment on this after seeing it, but I put my hand up maybe 2 slides ago. Could you go back to, I believe it was 22. Right, on this, you had opened up for just a discussion about these benchmarking options here. And I do think that using the EQR would pose some complications for CAISO, and you already noted why you have the timeliness issue with it, as well as all of the assumptions that you have to use to clean the data to be an actual representative benchmark for your purpose here. That's why on these types of things, I would lean more towards the hub prices. However, not like not necessarily a real-time hub price here. And I think that what you'd really be looking for is first define what it is you're after. And I when I think about using these prices, the first thing I think is, well, let me look at what the RA product is today, which is an obligation to bid at the RA quantity for the month. So that's a much easier price to nail down, because you can use hub prices and futures, and that would actually give you a really good sense of what people are paying for, I'll say, quote unquote capacity at that point, because they're buying firm energy outside of the CAISO, or in some instances at the CAISO hubs. And when you in a world of where there's no, say, formal capacity product yet, that firm energy is their capacity product, and that's what they're representing, that they're willing to pay for that firm product. So it's a really good look. At least it's easier if you're looking at things in terms of this monthly thing. But then I get some pause here, because we're talking about RA replacement. So you'd have to get from there down to, say, whatever it is, a daily or weekly sort of version of that. And I think when you think of things in terms of capacity commitments, it's all there to be covering the same type of costs and the money that's missing from the day ahead and real time markets. So, getting someone committed for 1 week out of 4 weeks essentially is saying, I need to make up all of that money for the month in that 4 weeks that I'm getting my commitment for, which would tend to say that you should use in that instance, a 4 times multiplier on it. And I don't know how well that really scales once you start talking about things on daily. But another option for the daily going price is to look at days forward prices, rather than just your day ahead hub price. So that could be something that you look into related to this concept here. Any thoughts on that before I go to, or reactions, I should say?
Appreciate the feedback and that leaning, and I think it's something that we can take another kind of closer look at. But did you have another comment there as well?
Yeah, no, I think it was either on 23 or 24. I got, if you could go to slide 23. Yeah, so whenever, you come into this discussion on 23 and 24 about using real-time pricing or value of lost load, I sort of for a second thought that we were in the scarcity pricing initiative. And because those are, you know, real-time pricing is like you know, should be an indication of the need for the energy in real time, whether it's RTD 15-minute or what have you. And to the extent that those are what you would say are too low, that's a problem to solve in price formation, which is, I think, outside of the scope of this initiative. And I tend to wonder if you go now to slide 23, or I'm sorry, we're on 23, 24. Yeah, at least 2 out of the 3 items here are related to real-time and day-ahead price formation. And I think that probably CAISO's efforts along those fronts, on that front, will be better addressed in that scarcity pricing initiative that you all have open right now. And I also wonder, to the extent that that current issue is corrected in that initiative, how much concern is left for as far as the availability goes today. And I think, let me just frame that out a little bit. If you think about, you know, what is the capacity contract? It's a must offer to CAISO. So, you know, that means I have to be providing bids and be available to provide those bids to CAISO so that CAISO can use me if they need to use me, or, you know, in some instances, they don't need me, they can then clear more exports, et cetera, to help the neighbors. But initially, it is a commitment to the CAISO balancing authority area to provide them bids so that they can dispatch me. So it seems that if we're talking about penalty sort of structure that's focused on the availability of those bids, I think we first recognize that the first penalty that's incurred with no RA policy in place is that the resource fails to be able to achieve those revenues. So if CAISO were to fix its scarcity pricing issues and start using something, I don't think CAISO would ever go to $35,000, but some higher value of lost load, they fix their issues at their RTD pricing. I tend to wonder how much that actually solves this problem, because my whole economics are now different as an operator of, hey, CAISO really, the prices are trending that they're really going to be needing me this afternoon, and prices are going to be really high. I really want that revenue. Maybe I can limp the unit along, or maybe I want to perform maintenance overnight a week before so that I can make sure that I'm there at that time, and then therefore avoid the forced outage altogether. In and of itself, it's more of on the incentive side rather than the penalty side. So then I wonder, so what's left to penalize? And I think that's really the question that I'd like to see you guys explore in the paper, which is if the real-time and day-ahead incentives are not there, what's current under the current rules, what's left to penalize? And then if you, with your coordination with the scarcity pricing initiative, if you assume some portion of that gets fixed there, what's left to be penalized that under these rules? Because I agree, if someone sells a contract, what they're doing is they're committing themselves to providing you bids, and you're expecting that they're going to be available to provide those bids. To the extent that the day-ahead real-time market prices are not enough of an incentive for them to do that, now you have the gap, and I'd really like to see you zero in on that gap in your next iteration of the paper.
Thank you, Terry. And I think I'll do a quick reaction. I think you're really getting at that kind of foundational question about like what defines RA. And so like maybe if I look at sort of like, I know that we're gonna, Walter Graff from PGPM described their proposal. So maybe I'll just talk about New England really quick, about sort of their pay for performance and how I view it is. You know, what they have is like similar mechanism where they are basically have a very strong incentive during reserves shortage events, where for RA, when they look at RA resources, if you're, or look at really kind of all resources, if you're performing above your RA level, you know, relative, like on a percentage basis relative to the fleet, you are given a very strong incentive mechanism, you know, almost $10,000. And if you're below it, you're basically penalized for at a level of $10,000. And kind of the way I view it is that the RA really has teeth and consequences. There's a difference between an RA and non-RA resource, or what's shown or not. And where if you're RA, you really are sort of, it's almost like a call option that can be viewed at that real-time price, like let's just say it's $1,000 or $2,000, whatever their administrative set value is during those reserve shortage events. But they're creating this teeth for RA to say, hey, if you're not available, there are going to be consequences, and if you overperform, there's going to be a very strong incentive to overperform during that. And so I think that's part of how, at least how I view it, as giving sort of a scarcity price mechanism. I think what you're getting at how much of it is sort of just an upside incentive via scarcity pricing versus how much does RA perform a role to say, hey, if you're not available and you're not performing during these tight conditions, there are sort of consequences to selling RA and to showing RA to the ISO. And if you're not available, you'll face consequences for doing that. So I think those are the trade-offs we're looking at here, and we're trying to figure out what is the mechanism and how far should we go via our programming design. But
yeah. Thanks for that. I want to be careful there, though, when we start talking about overperforming. It's and that's under some different mechanism that looks like is not part of the proposal right now. And the question that comes up is overperforming compared to what? Compared to my RA contract value, I bring more bids, or if we're talking about something else, such as under a pay performance scheme, which I think we should save for a whole other discussion, because it doesn't look like it's that's not what we're talking about in these slides right now. But I want to be careful there in terms of talking about overperformance. But the other point I wanted to make also, and this is the one that there could be, I can see a frame of thought that says, look, I sold RA, or you sold, let's say you sold me RA, and that means you should be bidding into the CAISO market to that value. To the extent that you're not performing to the contract, essentially is kind of how someone could see it. And I think in that frame of mind, then it becomes, well, okay, now we're talking about how do you make that right? And what it looks like here, seeing this spread of options, is that perhaps even just recouping whatever the contract price is not enough. And I know that there's issues with just tying it straight back to the contract price itself. But I think this is saying, you're saying, hey, what's the right level to set that sort of penalty, because the contract is to perform to the RA value. I'll say perform, but it's to provide bids to the RA value, and you were not able to do that. So therefore, how do we recoup an ability to, or your ability or lack of ability to perform to that contract value? And maybe that's the right sort of framing. And I think where that leads you is what's the going rate of RA, which is where you're leaning right now, which is looking at the bilateral RA prices, or looking at some way to come up with an equivalent value of RA.
Yeah, thanks, Perry. Yeah, that's good feedback. I know we have 5 more callers, and I want to make sure that we have a guest speaker from PJM we want to get to. So maybe we'll try to go through these last 5 relatively quickly, and try to wrap up at 11:10 at the latest.
Yeah.
But who's calling next?
Next up, we have Noah.
Hi, this is Noah Tom from Middle River Power. I thought the conversation from Perry was and Arthur was really great. Looking forward to more discussion on that. The question is sort of on the EEA watches and so forth. Is that sort of on a 1 by 1 megawatt, correlation basis of based on how much LRAs set their RA requirements versus maybe the real-time load, to the extent that if we have lower RA requirements that are set by LRAs that are not meeting the 0.1, you tend to have greater events as you showed a couple of slides ago.
So if we go to slide 17, event producer, Noah, correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm hearing from your comment is almost a notion of having LRA-specific the RMOs to EEA3s, and I'm not suggesting that. It's
no, I'm not suggesting it either.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm simply asking in aggregate, we look at 2022 and into 2025, to which we've apparently already had 2 restricted maintenance operations events in 2025. Like, how much of that is correlated to the amount of supply that is being required to be procured by LSCs?
Are you advocating for potential analysis that would look at an LRA's obligation versus what was kind of made available during that event? So,
yeah,
for example,
I think a little bit. I think certainly a little bit, because I'm just trying to better understand. This is, for the ISO to operate the grid on a real-time basis, getting to EEA3 in 2022, and I suspect more events in 2020 as well. And along with the supply-demand balance, as we get into 2025, I'm wondering whether or not sort of different counting conventions and accreditation methodologies by various LRAs would skew this data as well.
thanks, Noah. We can think about that and kind of take that back, but thanks for that observation or recommendation of area of exploration.
Thanks. Also, will generators be allowed to find or provide substitute capacity versus MORA, or versus taking MORA, I guess, as we currently do with rain?
So I think some of your question relates to, what's happening with the outage and substitution proposal. As we discussed in our last meeting, we're hoping that the new approach kind of allows for periods where substitute capacity doesn't need to be provided, also kind of allows there to be a pool mechanism for more kind of liquid RA transactions. And I think one of the key benefits there is, greater granularity of buying and selling RA if we're doing it on a daily basis versus today's kind of 30-day strip, and also kind of providing that incentive to make capacity available to the pool in that SC could be paid for it and not just hold it back in case they need substitute capacity. So, your question there of will there be capacity available, very much tied to some of the reforms we're looking at for outage and substitution, and for kind of exploring the depth of the pool and analysis to highlight the potential depth of that pool there. Is that where you were going, Noah?
Well, maybe in my mind, the way we've been discussing the pool was for planned outages, not under forced. But I personally think we can possibly utilize the pool for forced outages. But if we go to the assumption that forced outages do not access the pool, then would there be, how would the ISO sort of design this mechanism to allow LSCs, or I'm sorry, not LSCs, to allow generators to minimize their MORA penalties? Does that make sense? Like in something like, how do we provide substitute capacity under forced outage space in the new world?
Yeah, that's a good question, Noah. And at least the way I was thinking about it was like to agree that there is, that a resource has substituted capacity and is not sort of no longer being relied upon for RA. That would be sort of, they would not be having the exposure to this incentive mechanism. And so, like, to me, that was kind of the key thing, is like, if you're actually taking the actions to have alternative capacity, recognizing that you're going to be on outage, that would be sort of a step that you can take. And so I think we'll go back and think about how to explain that mechanism clearly. And, but yeah, thanks, Noah. Good question.
Thanks.
All right, can we go next to Steve?
We have Colin.
Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped over Colin.
My name is Colin Smith. I'm with LEAP, a demand response aggregator based in California. I wanted to go back to that note about this new system accommodating the QC methodology being developed by the CPUC and CEC. First off, that methodology also looked at using RA prices to benchmark the penalties. And they ultimately walked back from that approach, I think, because of some difficulties likely similar to what you are encountering. But I would recommend maybe reaching out to that team and comparing notes to get a better sense of what their challenges were, and maybe figuring out if it is possible to overcome those challenges, that you share it with them as well. But I just wanted to ask for more detail on what you meant by accommodate the QC methodology they're developing, because that methodology contains both an availability penalty or availability component and a performance component. And I don't see how, the intention was that would exempt DR resources from RAIN, because there'd be a separate availability penalty for demand response resources. By accommodate, do you mean that demand response resources would not be subject to this MORA penalty if the DRQC penalty is implemented?
That's correct. And thanks for the recommendation on talking to that team. All right, could we go next to Steve Keen?
Hi, this is Steve. I just kind of want to follow up on some of the stuff Perry was saying. On that slide showing the price options, I mean, the real-time prices, I think, are providing, they should be providing an incentive for the resources to be there. I can't imagine that well, maybe this is a question and something we should be looking at, is why would a generator not choose to be providing power when, prices are expected to be, $500 to $1,000 or even higher? And I think the scarcity pricing gets at some of that. So, and if we're going to have UCAP and they're going to get dinged on the amount of capacity that they can actually sell, I think we need to make sure that we're not over penalizing them too much. I mean, I don't know if an extra seems to me missing out on $2,000 an hour power may be enough of an incentive to get people to show up. So I think that's all. For the sake of time, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Steve. And let's go next to Michaela.
Sorry, I have a cold, so I've lost my voice a bit. Michaela Flag, Customized Energy Solutions. So I guess to follow on some of these conversations, I've sort of seen more aggressive scarcity pricing in the energy markets, as sort of like a counter to a more like capacity performance mechanism, as if like you kind of pursue one or the other. And I think one concern could be that if CAISO does go down, like incorporating a vol in their energy pricing, and then you also incorporate a vol in this new incentive mechanism, then you could easily get into instances where a unit has a force outage, sorry, in between the day ahead and the real-time market. So then they're buying back their day ahead schedule at vol or something close to it, and then they're also paying this penalty at vol. So it could just get to be really punitive. And I think you kind of see that in some markets where like MISO's gone fairly aggressive with scarcity pricing and they don't have these sort of performance mechanisms. And then some of the other markets who have gone forward with capacity performance mechanisms don't have as aggressive scarcity pricing mechanisms. And so I don't know if that's a conversation that you're having internally at CAISO of sort of that trade-off between this mechanism and then some of the scarcity pricing mechanisms being pursued or considered.
Thanks for that. Yeah, great points. I think that we're certainly having a lot of conversations internally on those trade-offs. I think as we alluded to before, I think there's kind of a question about how much are we relying on the incentives created by day-ahead and real-time energy prices versus sort of, is there a different obligation and incentive that should apply to RA? What does it mean to be RA in the context of availability and performance that might look different than sort of the incentives that are provided to all resources? But yeah, really good points and questions you're bringing up, Michaela. I appreciate that.
Okay, and I have one other quick question. So with the benchmarking, would this be something that would be determined like annually and published? Would it be monthly values? Would just like, would this be something that would be known like ahead of the month, like what the penalty price would be?
I think we would look to publish it so that that penalty price is known ahead of the month. I think it's an open question in terms of, how, if we're going down more of an administrative route and where we might be pulling that data or how that price might be set, that might dictate if it's more of a monthly, annual, or kind of updated once every few years. So I think just more discussions are needed on that front, but really kind of looking to have this discussion on stakeholder input on, what penalty pricing option we should pursue ahead of kind of digging into further details on kind of the granularity that we would be publishing or granularity that we would be developing some of that pricing at. But good input and feedback. Thank you. All right, can we go to Paul Nelson next?
Yeah, this is Paul with the CPUC Energy Division. I was looking at slide 24 on the pros and cons of the options, and it seems like the pros represents the economic consequences that an unavailable RA contributed to, and then almost as immediately, implicitly, is the reverse, is the con, is that the energy is a penalty for RA may not reflect unavailability. So it seems like I was conflicted whether the energy price is a pro or a con. And I guess more information if there's shortage, if these are not impacting energy prices, then what is the impact? But I know in time, since you want to go to the PGA presentation, I'll just leave it at that and we can discuss later.
Thanks, Paul. I think there's a recognition that it's really dependent on what system conditions are at that time. There could be a direct correlation with unavailable capacity increasing prices, or, as I mentioned with that localized transmission emergency, system prices could be very low. And so there might not be kind of a correlation with that unavailable RA in kind of a localized area. So just recognizing it's really conditional on system conditions, what's happening with congestion, what's happening with other kind of outages on the system. So more to unpack and why it's not a strict pro or con in terms of the correlation there. There's not always a one-to-one depending on what's happening on the system.
Oh, I do have one quick. So the RTD, that would be a nodal price at where the generator is? So it would reflect local constraints? Or would it be more
I'm
like
really
a
kind
DLAP?
of bringing out I was thinking of it more at like the DLAP level in terms of what load is paying and not necessarily at that specific node. But I brought up local conditions with the idea that if we tie this to transmission emergencies, there is a difference between a local transmission emergency versus a system transmission emergency. And that's a case where a local transmission emergency may not result in higher prices. It might not kind of have a correlation with, you know, what resources are available in terms of how it impacts the real-time price.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. All right, let's go to Patrick, and then we'll take a 5-minute break before going to Walter Graff. Patrick.
Hello, this is Patrick Cunningham of the Public Advocate's Office at the CPUC. I want to comment that on the assessment hours, I think reducing them to just focusing on the stressed hours would fail to meet the objective to incentivize meeting the must-offer obligation, since MOO hours, of course, are for generally 24 hours a day for all months that the resource is contracted or on a supply plan for RA. It seems like if you're just focusing on stressed hours, then a resource could take an outage from April through May with no real consequences without substitution. And even if UCAP is looking also at supply cushion hours, then it wouldn't, there wouldn't be much consequence for there either. And it's just not clear to me why we'd focus on scarce hours when that's when energy prices are also quite high, providing a pretty good incentive for availability, and possibly leaving gaps in other months where there might be less resource availability than we'd want, if just because resources might be on outage despite having a must-offer obligation. And it's pretty concerning to me, but I guess I missed the work groups where that this was discussed further last year. But wanted to raise that. It's concerning to me.
Yeah, maybe, Patrick, can you maybe expand upon that just a little bit? So like, I think that you got the elements right, where we kind of thought of it as, you know, RAIM right now today is focused on certain RAIM assessment hours. So it's not all hours, but sort of focused on sort of key hours for more, you know, from a reliability standpoint. The way we're kind of thinking about it is sort of there'd be sort of two mechanisms sort of doing the work. You know, one would be we have that nice graphic on UCAP versus MURA, but UCAP will be doing a lot of the work in terms of you know, which either could be applied by the LRAs or it could be applied, you know, by the CAISO. A lot of stuff is still TBD there. But then we'd have this on top of it in terms of providing sort of an even stronger incentive during these more critical hours. I was wondering, Patrick, do you have sort of an alternative in terms of what you think the design should look like or what the focus should be on? And like, in terms of maybe just covering more hours or covering kind of a different set? Like, we kind of viewed this as sort of already kind of a little bit of a layered approach, but.
Yeah, it's like, I wasn't around when RAIM was initially designed, but it's not clear to me why there wouldn't be penalties for not meeting the must-offer obligations for all hours that a resource is contracted to be obligated to provide itself to be available to the ISO. There's probably some feasibility issues with that, of course, and working around a lot of issues, but yeah, it's like at least a once-a-day assessment seems to make a lot of sense. I'm not sure what like the technical limitations are to enforcing something like that, so I can't speak too much for it, but it does seem to make sense to apply a penalty if something's being paid to be available, but it's failing to do so. Granted, contracts, I do know some RA contracts may have non-payment provisions for non-delivery that comes out of scheduling, but if a resource needs to take an outage and can avoid a substitution, it seems like why wouldn't a whole mess of generators do that when energy prices are low and there's no binding penalty for it? That's just a theory, of course, very hypothetical, but I'm and I'm also maybe missing what other incentives there may be or penalties for not being available to the ISO, maybe a code of conduct. I'm not sure. Yeah, so that's my position on it.
No, that's helpful, Patrick. And obviously there are some incentives just from being able to receive, day ahead and real-time market revenues that would apply to what the general incentives look like. I think you're asking probably fair questions of like that we've asked ourselves internally of, should this be applied to a much more broad set of hours, and where the trade-offs look like for doing that. And I think where we landed was more of the applying sort of looking to develop, in partnership with the LRAs, counting methodologies that generally reflect availability, through UCAP and other mechanisms, was sort of the kind of foundational approach, but then focusing more just this on those emergency conditions. But you're asking good questions, and yeah, love to. For the sake of time, I might wrap it up. I'd love to see you hear more in your comments if you feel like there's sort of a different proposal out there that we should consider. Yeah, thanks, Patrick. This is really helpful feedback.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Well, for the sake of time, let's go ahead. Christina, could we take a 5-minute break? And when we come back, we'll have Walter Graff from PJM talk about their capacity performance mechanism, and very topical for this group to kind of have that benchmarking. Really looking forward to that presentation. So with that, Christina, do you want to give us kind of some next step directions?
Yeah, so we'll take a quick 5-minute break and return shortly. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate the robust discussion that we had on sort of a possible proposal for reforming our RAIN design. Kind of as we transition, I wanted to welcome Walter Graf, the Chief Economist at PJM. And just to set some of the context, at least, partly this is based on the feedback and request of stakeholder participants, but as a part of our process, really trying to understand sort of what the best practices are of the other ISO and RTO markets and lessons learned from that. So I really appreciate Walter taking the time today to discuss PJM's capacity performance mechanisms. And really thanks again, Walter, and please take it away.
Thank you so much for having me. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, coming through clearly.
Great. Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for the opportunity to present and to join you. It is in a small way, way for me to get back to California. I spent about 6 years in California in grad school, and I miss it dearly. So you guys are very lucky to be there. Today, I'll be providing an overview of PJM's capacity performance mechanism, a key component of our capacity market. My goal really is to explain its purpose, how it works, what we've learned since its implementation, and trying to highlight any aspects that might be particularly relevant for CAISO, given the little bit that I know about where you guys are in the discussions. I was told to plan to go through all of my slides before taking questions, so I'll do that unless I hear otherwise. Could you go to the next slide, please? So here I have just a summary of really the highest level view of the capacity performance mechanism, which is what we call our equivalent of ISO New England's pay for performance, which you may have heard of. Electricity resources that participate in PJM's capacity market must perform when called upon to do so in a system emergency. And I think like CAISO, PJM is facing a rapidly evolving grid. We're seeing more renewables, fewer traditional fossil generation resources, certainly somewhat behind California in penetration of intermittence and storage resources, but still also experiencing increased dependence on demand side resources. It's creating new challenges for ensuring reliability, particularly during reliability events that are outside of the normal peak demand driven events and certainly unexpected events. Capacity performance was originally introduced sort of in the broader context of this evolving landscape to really fundamentally to incentivize and to try to ensure that resources procured in our capacity market are truly available and able to perform and incentivized to perform whenever they're needed every hour of the year. But really, we do that by having a particularly strong incentive to perform during a very small number of hours that are determined based on system conditions that I'll talk about in a little bit. The capacity performance requirement was implemented in 2016, so not quite 10 years ago, following capacity shortfalls during the 2014 polar vortex. So it was the original driver for it was actually a non-peak load driven event, at least not summer peak. And it was more recently tested again in Winter Storm Elliott, which was another winter event. So one of the benefits of capacity performance is that it incentivizes performance whenever it happens to be that the system ultimately needs it, rather than just during peak. The core sort of central design element of capacity performance is that there's a really reasonably substantial penalty rate, and those that fail to meet their obligation face charges, and that money goes into a pool such that those that overperform are entitled to bonus payments funded by the underperformers. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like in a couple slides. So that's the highest level overview of little bit of the driver why we went in this direction and what it looks like. Can you go to the next slide, please? So maybe I'll just hit this briefly. The core objectives are there's a few of them. Ultimately, I think the primary ones are to incentivize performance and to penalize non-performance of resources during times of system stress. And the hope, the goal, the objective of this was ultimately to strengthen the overall reliability of the PJM system, and to send clear market signals that encourage investment in reliable and flexible resources any time of the year. I think maybe for the sake of time, I can go to the next slide and spend a little bit more time on the details. So I'm going to spend just a little bit of time talking about the kinds of system conditions that trigger a performance assessment event. Just for context, I think relative to the types of assessments that you guys are considering in CAISO now, these are substantially more rare. I think we've had somewhere on the order of probably an order of 2 or 3 years that have had any performance assessment intervals since this was introduced. And during those years, it was less than 24 hours each. So you can do the math, but basically it's really just a couple of hours on average per year that we have performance assessment intervals. And those are concentrated in a couple of years, and really most years are not expected to have performance assessment events. We recently reformed and made changes to the triggers for performance assessment events. They were previously relatively slightly broader and would be triggered when we were at a certain point in our system emergency events. Specifically, when PJM deployed demand response was one of the primary triggers. There was a concern that, and this was particularly salient during Elliott, there was a concern that the calling of demand response was a somewhat subjective operational decision, and that this was not an objective enough criteria to trigger performance assessment intervals. And so we moved to what you see here on the slide, which is a sort of a 2-condition trigger. Under condition 1, a performance assessment interval is triggered whenever we have a primary reserve shortage combined with certain emergency actions, including max gen events, curtailment of non-essential building loads and voltage reduction warnings, and manual load jump warnings. So if any of those are combined with a primary reserve shortage, then a performance assessment event would be triggered. And under condition 2, a performance assessment event would be triggered when we have sort of a more severe emergency actions, including load shed directive, manual load dump action, voltage reduction action, and a deploy all resources action. So the objective really is to, I mean, even before the triggers were somewhat made even more narrow, the objective really was to focus on just a small handful of hours on the system when it's most stressed. Let me go on to slide 5, please. I want to talk a little bit about what the bonus and penalty calculations look like. I think that one of the primary points is that it's a closed penalty and bonus pool, which really means that resources failing to meet their commitments and are assessed a substantial penalty essentially pay into a pool such that those that exceed their performance obligation, including uncommitted resources, are then entitled to receive some of the funds from the underperforming resources. And the way that we figure out who is penalized and who overperformed is actually, rather than being relative to a predetermined megawatt obligation, is adjusted for a balancing ratio. And the balancing ratio essentially adjusts for system conditions, such that if we have a performance assessment interval during an hour when system load is somewhat lower, then we essentially lower than would have been expected, so lower than peak loads, then everyone's performance obligation is sort of proportionally derated relative to the amount of capacity that they sold forward. And so that balancing ratio happens to be, or maybe by design, it's the number that really quite closely manages to get an equal number of underperforming megawatts and overperforming megawatts, such that with a few exceptions, the intent was to get the penalty rate to equal the bonus rate. So you put all of the money from the underperforming megawatts into the pool, and then if you divide by the overperforming megawatts, you get a similar, if not exactly the same, bonus rate. So the level of that non-performance charge rate is, just to give you an order of magnitude, it's about on the order of $3,000 a megawatt hour. And that's determined by the net cost of new entry, net CONE, which PJM calculates based on an administrative procedure, calculates for the delivery year. And then we take that net CONE and we divide by an assumed 30 hours of emergency or PAI. And this 30 hours was, I think, based on some analysis and largely assumptions, when capacity performance was instituted in 2016, it has, in reality, the true number of performance assessment intervals has been much lower than this, but the penalty rate has remained. I might just provide a little bit of sort of editorializing of the penalty rate. I mean, what this means is that in some sense, reasonable people can disagree about whether this penalty rate is high or low. On the one hand, $3,000 a megawatt hour is pretty high, sort of in absolute terms, certainly compared to the energy prices that we post most of the time. On the other hand, it means that a severely underperforming resource usually shouldn't expect to lose most of their capacity revenues due to penalties. And so in that sense, it maybe doesn't provide even enough incentive. It maybe there's an argument to be made that it could be higher in order to provide stronger incentives for market participants that take on capacity obligations to really do everything that they can to make good on those obligations. And the last thing here on the slide that I'll mention is our stop loss provision, which limits a resource's maximum annual penalty. When capacity performance was instituted, this was initially a 1.5 times net CONE stop loss, and now it's equal to 1.5 times the auction revenues, which historically have been lower than net CONE, but in theory could be higher than net CONE. Let me skip to my last substantive slide, and then maybe we open for questions. I was thinking a little bit about what to say about lessons learned from capacity performance, and I think probably the most important takeaway is that we think that this largely works. There have been sort of complexities with implementation, but by and large, as a framework for incentivizing resources to comply with their obligations and to be sort of fully economically incentivized to make the preparatory decisions and investments such that they provide the capacity value that we expect them to provide when they take a capacity obligation. We by and large, we think that this has been effective. We anecdotally, we've seen that certain resource owners have installed dual fuel or adjusted their gas scheduling practices or made other changes to improve resource performance and reduce penalty risk. Probably both on the sort of longer term forward investment time frame, like investment decision making time frame, as well as day ahead intraday decision making when the probability of a performance assessment event climbs. We see market participants making decisions differently because the price that they face on the margin is different. One difficulty that we've had with capacity performance, and that we've thought about reevaluating, although we haven't made great strides in this, is with regard to the rarity of performance assessments. And I think there's a sense in which the performance assessments being as rare as they are and having the penalty rate that they are may sort of leave some money on the table, such that it could be difficult to justify making certain economic reliability improving investments to avoid a penalty rate that is at the end of the day capped to 50% higher than the revenues that you got in the first place, probably not expected to actually hit most years, and during which the penalty rate probably isn't high enough really to it's certainly high enough to hurt, and certainly high enough to incentivize different decision making, but it may not be enough to be sort of fully salient to make all of the economic decisions for improving reliability to be made. And then the last thing that I'd add is there have been a few design choices that we've made that have probably decreased certainty for market participants and increased complexity in administering assessments. Probably the two biggest ones are subjectivity with regard to resource excusals, where we have, I think, differently from the implementation that ISO New England has, we have a reasonably long list of ways that a market participant that has underperformed could have that underperformance excused. And I think that it turns out that that's probably problematic in at least two different ways. One is sort of on a forward basis, and after an event, it can be, reasonable people can disagree about whether the excusals are fair or not. And then the other is any sort of subjectivity in how those excusals are determined, say as a function of what directives the market participant got from an operator during an emergency event. It's really quite burdensome to actually implement a performance assessment interval assessment when it occurs. And the other one is one that I touched on earlier, the performance assessment triggers, which when PJM first implemented the design, included demand response deployment, and the subjectivity with that sort of led us to the subjectivity of that raised some problems, and ultimately we reconsidered that, and chose the triggers to be as objective as possible. maybe the last one that I'd say is I think that we ultimately probably would do this again if we were starting from scratch, and we would probably end up with something that looks reasonably similar to what we have now. I mean, I'm speaking for myself, not for all of PJM. I think we really do think that this works, and we really do think that having performance assessment intervals tied to system emergencies really makes it so that participants are most incentivized to provide that availability when it's most valuable to the system, and less incentivized to improve their availability or their performance during hours when doing that might just not be as valuable or as economic. I think I went a little bit longer than I wanted to, but let me stop there, and happy to take any questions.
Walter, this is Anya. So just a big thank you for coming and sharing this presentation with us. Some of the items that stand out, and I'll maybe try and kick off the conversation before turning it over to our stakeholders, but two of the areas that stand out in terms of areas that we're grappling with and looking to decide on kind of relate to the applicability and exemptions. And maybe I'd just like to hear a little bit more about kind of your thoughts around how PJM kind of tied this to condition 1 or 2, and maybe the reflection that you have that this may be too narrow. And, you know, in a Walter graph kind of is king for a day, you know, how many hours or how would you think about redesigning that? And then I'd also like to hear a little bit more about some of the factors that went into some of the exemptions, just recognizing, you know, more variable energy resources and storage are also interconnecting into PJM systems. So maybe just two initial kind of areas to reflect on.
Yeah, sure. I think on the first one, it really is a balancing act, and I'm not sure that even if I was king for the day, I'm not exactly sure what I would do in this regard. I think there are factors that sort of tend to push me pretty strongly in both directions. On the one hand, making the performance assessment interval trigger narrower certainly makes it less subjective. I think the narrowest sort of reasonable trigger would be you only trigger performance assessment intervals during load shed. That's sort of the most objective, and you can say, you know, any energy, you know, EEA events before that, you know, there is at least some degree of operator intervention that impacts that. On the other hand, and that is, you know, we didn't go nearly that narrow. We included also, you know, less severe system emergencies and in combination with reserve shortage. But we did move in that direction relative to where we were, I think, when we started CP. That said, I think we sort of went into it eyes wide open, recognizing that we were, you know, making perhaps even more severe the issue that I touched on in the second bullet on the last slide, with regarding the rarity of performance assessment intervals. I think reducing the salience and sort of having performance assessment intervals that are just too rare makes it harder for market participants to plan around. So even though theoretically, I think the incentive alignment may be better when you have, you know, very, very tightly narrowly defined triggers that align, you know, super well with the riskiest events and with load shed risk. I think practically moving too far in that direction is difficult. I guess the other point that I'd make is when you move really far in the direction of having very narrow performance assessment events. In order to put enough money on the line, in a sense, you need to have a really high penalty rate. And you know, that's, I think, unpalatable for maybe any number of reasons. So spreading that money out a little bit, again, maybe even while harming a tiny bit the alignment between the assessment intervals and system risk, I think can be really helpful in some of those other dimensions. I think your second question was about the exemptions and the excusals. I'll mention just a couple of them. One of them is with regard to planned maintenance, like scheduled maintenance. And essentially our rule is if you have planned maintenance and we have approved that maintenance outage, you are excused from performance assessment events. I think that the biggest reason that we went in that direction was that we heard from our operators that they didn't want to incentivize market participants to defer maintenance when they should be taking a resource offline to maintain it. That said, I think not excusing resources is also, probably intellectually defensible. My understanding is that this is what ISO New England does, is not excusing resources that are on outage, and really that puts the onus on the market participant to, they're highly incentivized to take those outages when the risk of facing a performance assessment interval is lowest. Which probably is directionally a good incentive to have. The other exemption that we have is it really depends on directives that market participants get, like during the operating day. If a market participant, say, is in a gen pocket and they get a directive from the system operator to ramp down or to turn off, they would get an exemption in that case. But that also applies, like for example, to storage resources that, say, may be directed to charge earlier in the day when we are in a performance assessment interval, but say when we have some reasonable margin that we're not necessarily at risk of shedding load in that hour. So they're directed to charge because there are, some available resources. Normally, normally without an exemption, that would, they would be penalized because not only are they not providing energy during a performance assessment event, they're actually drawing energy, so that's even worse. But again, I think we wanted to make sure that our market participants had sort of strong incentives to follow operator directive and to follow dispatch. And one of the ways that we do that is by exempting resources that are basically doing exactly what they were told to do by operations from facing penalties. Again, though, that I think from the perspective of incentives to follow dispatch, that makes a lot of sense. But it does introduce a little bit of sort of incomplete incentives with regard to probably battery operation in general, because really relative to other resources, depending on these resources performance characteristics, they may just systematically be getting told to do different things by the system operator. Like if most performance assessment events are not load shed events, batteries could be told to charge during most of them, and so they're actually doing exactly the opposite as everyone else. And so that is a little wonky.
Yeah, thanks for kind of digging a little bit more into some of the incentives and background there. Maybe next we can turn to some of our stakeholders. And Christina, would you mind, or could we unmute Brian Faker's line?
Good morning, Dr. Graff. Thank you for your presentation. This is Brian Thaker with Middle River Power. I wanted to ask, in 2022, I think it was, PJM had a significant event with Winter Storm Elliott that resulted in the imposition of billions of dollars of performance penalties. A lot of those were for resources that could not get gas as a result of the conditions during Winter Storm Elliott. I'm just curious, looking in your rearview mirror, what do you think the big lesson learned for PJM and the performance penalties was coming out of Winter Storm Elliott?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'm glad you raised that because I probably should have um, uh, uh, mentioned Winter Storm Elliott in my presentation. I think probably one of the biggest takeaways there is not for the market design itself, but for operations. And I think, you know, knowing now what we know about how how resources performed during Winter Storm Elliott and the incentives that they did or didn't have to, say, start early when it was less cold or to procure gas. One of the things that I think going forward we have seen our operations doing and planning to do even more going forward is just operating more conservatively. So we have, in the last couple polar vortex events, we've been calling gas resources online, say in advance of a long weekend when the gas market is less liquid. We've been calling resources online for energy. Basically to provide energy and displace other resources that would otherwise be providing energy and getting, say, more of a reserve service from those other resources. But the fact that, well, actually, let me back up just a tiny bit. I mean, to provide a little bit of context on sort of this was before my time at PJM, but what I understand was the expectation when capacity performance was originally designed is that by incentivizing resources more strongly to perform during system risk events, and by not exempting resources from performance penalties when, say, they weren't committed by the operator or when they weren't able to get gas and so on, the objective was actually to have more of that of those operational, like conservative operational decisions to be made by market participants. And I think what we saw in Winter Storm Elliott is, back to what I said earlier, on the one hand, it was a huge amount of money, right? Billions of dollars in penalties, but maybe also at the same time, not enough money to actually incentivize market participants to do everything that they could to provide that availability. So we saw calculations that market participants shared with us that showed, even, you know, on a day ahead basis, given the cost of gas and given, you know, the highest potential price of energy and the highest potential capacity performance penalty, it was actually not economic for us to schedule gas because gas was so expensive. And so in that sense, you know, you could almost say the penalty incentive was even not strong enough to incentivize to get market participants to do that pre-commitment kind of decision making that we expected that they would be able to do. And so I think because of that, going forward, we're actually taking maybe a stronger role in doing that commitment centrally.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Event producer, could we unmute Bonnie Blair's line?
Hi, this is Bonnie Blair. I work with the Six Cities Group. Thanks for the presentation. I have a question about the current penalty price. You said it was 1.5 times auction revenues. Is that the auction, the clearing price in the auction times 1.5, like the unit cost clearing price times 1.5?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So let me clarify. So the penalty rate is actually net cone divided by 30. So it's essentially calculated such that we
Oh,
would
right. I'm
expect.
sorry. That was the
Yeah,
stop
yeah,
loss provision.
that's right.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I misspoke.
So
Yeah. Okay.
so the penalty rate basically says if you underperform, if you entirely underperform for 30 hours, you should expect to lose exactly net cone. And it used to be that the stop loss was set at 150% of that. So you would have to underperform for 45 hours straight to hit the stop loss. Now the stop loss is 150% of the auction revenues. So it could be that the stop loss hits, substantially before we even hit 30 hours of PAIs during low clearing price years. Does that help, Bonnie?
Yes, I think so. Yeah. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm not seeing any other questions in the queue. Walter, did you have any final thoughts before we go to wrap up the discussion?
I think I don't. I'm happy to be a resource if anyone at CAISO or any market participants would like to reach out and bounce ideas off or have any questions about our design. Please feel free to reach out. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you again for coming and presenting. I think it's very helpful in light of some of our kind of past conversations around benchmarking to actually have you come and speak to this. I really appreciate it, especially in light of just some key differences with having a centralized capacity market, but also kind of looking to have something or having something in place more like a pay for performance with your capacity performance design instead. So thank you again for coming and presenting. And with that, I'll turn things back to Christina for next steps.
Great, thank you, Anya. If we could move to slide 27, please. So for next steps, we have the comment deadline of March 13th. If any questions come up at any time, please email us at isostakeholderaffairs@kaiso.com. Next slide, please. And now we just have a quick announcement for insights into the ISO grid and market operations. Be on the lookout for our Energy Matters blog, or you can always subscribe. And with that, we'd like to thank you so much for joining today's discussion. As a reminder, this meeting was recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. The video file will be posted on the initiative webpage. We thank you very much, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.